Casting for Recovery is a retreat and fly fishing school for breast cancer survivors. The casting motion mimics lots of the therapy motions for lymphedema or soft tissue recovery. So it's wonderful that the women get to kind of recharge their batteries.
I fish like a mad woman sometimes. You can't get me to stop. And one could say your addictive personality is kicked in with fishing. And I look at that and go, is my life unmanageable? Is it causing me problems? I don't think so.
It's very hard to tie a fly today, a featherwing streamer, and not be able to find a little bit of Carrie Stevens methods in it. And she raised that whole craft arguably to an art form.
Welcome to the Flyline Podcast, where we enjoy the interesting stories behind the legendary guides and luminaries connected to Maine fishing. I'm Michael Jones. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Paul Cote. Paul Cote welcomes us into his revived antique space on Main Street in Oxford, Maine, where a lifetime of collecting tells the story of Maine's sporting past. His journey from growing up in Poland to early days in door-to-door sales to running small-town businesses, seeing some succeed and others fail, ultimately led him to a life built around buying, selling, and preserving pieces of sporting history. In this conversation, Paul shares how decades in the pawn business became the foundation for assembling a remarkable 40-year collection of Maine sporting artifacts. We talk about Norway area snowshoes, Paris manufacturing sleds and wagons, fish carvings and plaques from iconic makers, and antique firearms that each carry their own story. We also explore what he's learned about restoration, why auctions aren't the right fit for a collection like his, and his decision to begin selling pieces so they can find their way back into people's homes. Paul reflects on the value of history, the stories behind the objects, and the importance of keeping Maine's sporting heritage alive through the people who continue to care about it. Because this is an audio podcast and Paul's collection is so impressive to witness, it is imperative that you go to the blog section of the Flyline Podcast website to sample images we capture during the interview while visiting Paul's gallery. It is a privilege to share the story of someone who has spent a lifetime preserving the past and is now passing it on. Paul Cote, welcome to the Flyline Podcast.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, and where are we, Paul?
We're in my antique shop at 1192 Main Street in Oxford, Maine.
Tell me a little bit about it.
Well, I originally opened it maybe 15 years ago after I retired from the pawn shop downstairs that my son and I ran. And I ran it for a couple of years after being retired and realized one day that I really hadn't retired. I just changed jobs. And so I closed it and moved everything downstairs to the group shop and became a vendor. And I was a vendor I'm still a vendor downstairs. This space became empty, and it was empty for, I'm going to say, 6 or 7 years. And then I leased it to someone on a 3-year lease. And after their lease ran out, I decided to resurrect Pa's Antique Attic. Only thing different is I'm doing this kind of by chance or appointment. I've moved my office into the space, so I come to the office almost every day.
How big, just so the audience understands, Paul, explain how big this space is, because to me it's astronomical.
Well, it looks bigger because it's got nice high ceilings. We got about 13-foot ceilings in here. The space is only about 25 feet wide. It's a little over 100 feet long.
Yeah, it's long.
Yeah. So it's about 2,500 square feet.
I would say you have full inventory of sporting memorabilia. And what brings me into the conversation with you is the expansive collection you have of historic Maine fishing art, firearms. We're going to talk about all these things. And it's, to me, my head is just spinning. My friend Bill Pierce and also Gene Barr explained to me a little bit about you and your collection. They said you're going to have to hold your breath when you walk in the door. And that's, the goal is really, I think, for our audience to not only look at our website, and I understand you're building a new Facebook page, but to maybe get in the car and come up here. If they're really interested in collectible pieces, you're the guy to talk to.
Well, there.
Yeah. So tell me, this isn't how you got started in life, Paul. How did you tell me about where you grew up.
Oh, I grew up in Poland, Maine. So just down the street from here. But when I was kind of a youngster, my parents decided to move to California. And after about 5 years of living in California, they decided they better get me back to Maine. They thought I was going to turn into a juvenile delinquent or something, I guess. But California was a little different than Poland, Maine.
Where were you in California?
We lived in Paramount, Wilmington,
Yeah,
Compton, and Long Beach in the 5 years that we were there.
Why did your family move there?
Economic reasons, better jobs and stuff like that. My mother worked in the shoe shop. My father worked at a textile mill. And all of a sudden they get out there and he's working in the Standard Oil and she's working as a lady foreman in a shoe shop, not doing physical work, but doing supervisory work, making 5 times more income than they were making here.
Yeah.
So that was the motivation. But I have 2 sisters, and they were concerned. They were concerned about the kids. The lifestyle's a little different. You have to remember, when I moved to California, the last school I went to here in Poland, Maine, was a single classroom, 1 teacher. The first, second, third, and fourth grade were in that classroom with that teacher. First 2 rows was first grade, so on and so forth. And I left that school and went to Catskill Avenue School, where when the bell rang, you changed classes like you did in high school. You know, you walked through the quadrangle and you went and found your other class. I mean, I was lost. I was completely lost. So it took a while to acclimate. But anyway, they did the right thing for us. They got us back here, and it was something that I am very grateful that they did.
Were you into fishing and hunting as a young person? Was there something going on with your own personal interests that ultimately led you into this? Or what were you doing when you were young, Paul?
Well,
what were you interested in?
Well, I played football in high school. I was interested in high school sports and stuff like that. But mostly I was interested in not being poor. You know, my parents came back to the textile mills and the shoe shops and living on a 3rd back floor apartment, $8 a week rent, and paying for the refrigerator to keep running with quarters and a box behind the refrigerator, that type of thing. And I didn't want to be poor. I was motivated to do something to try to earn a good living.
You must have.
Well, I did. My dad got sick early and passed as an early, I mean, he wasn't very old when he passed away. And I left my mother kind of struggling with the 3 of us kids. So I had thought about maybe going to college, and I kind of gave that up because I couldn't see myself. Well, first of all, I couldn't afford it, and I didn't see any daylight to be. I wasn't that talented an athlete. I wasn't going to get any athletic scholarships. So I decided that after doing a little homework, that sales was the kind of background I wanted to get into because it didn't require a college education, and so I got into sales. And over the years, I have been more successful in that field than I think the average person would have been.
What was your first dip of the toe into the sales world? What were you selling initially?
I was full of brush.
Full of brush?
Yes.
No kidding.
Yeah, door to door.
No kidding.
Full of brush, door to door.
Yeah.
And I mean, I had worked at a couple of construction jobs prior to doing that after high school, and work all week making $1.50 an hour. And the first day I worked in full brush, I made as much money as I had done the previous week working in construction. So I thought, and I was wearing a cardigan sweater and slacks and driving around in my convertible.
Was that around here, Paul?
Well, I was living in Auburn, but my territory was in the Yarmouth area down in Maine, and so I was doing pretty well. I never thought that I would reach that level of success early, and never left it.
Just for my own clarity, what was the Fuller Brush Company? What did they produce?
Oh, they sold health and beauty aids, really, mostly, hand creams and that kind of stuff. And, but they also sold utilitarian items like brushes, kitchen brushes, and things like that. So they had a wide variety of products that they sold, and we represented them all.
Yeah.
And but it was basically selling direct door to door, knocking on the door, hi, I'm the full brush man, hand them a sample, hope they don't slam the door in your face. And if they didn't, then you got into the house and you went into your spiel. And for the most part, I was relatively successful at it,
Yeah.
Um,
You said you were in business with your son. So that tells me you were married and you had a family.
got married, a high school sweetheart. We got married. I did a short stint in the service. I was in the Army Reserves, so I did a short stint, 6 years. But after going through basic training and coming back home, I got married when I was 21 years old. And by 24 or 5, we had 4 children. Had 2 boys, tried for a girl, and got twin girls. So, I was motivated to go out and sell that full brush product stuff, but I went from that to selling office equipment, and I did a number of jobs, as a young person, and I always felt as though it was a step up and making a little more money, but working seemed to be my recreation. I thoroughly enjoyed. Someone told me early on that if you don't enjoy the work you're doing, you're paying too high a price to put bread on the table. And I always kept that in mind. And so I always really did enjoy what I was doing. And when I stopped enjoying it, I started doing something else, or I changed jobs. And curiously enough, I went through a long period of time where 5 years seemed to be the magic number. I would work for somebody or with somebody for 5 years and then leave that job and go to another one. And it always seemed like I was taking a step up when I did it, but it worked out all right.
Is there anything else that you did that you would consider to be unique before you got into what you're doing now?
Oh, sure. I did. I went to work. I joined the JCs. And that's where we did a little public speaking as a group, and they teach you how to talk to the public and things like that. And that was quite a growth experience, personal growth experience, working for the JCs. I was the state chairman for the first walkathon, Maine walkathon. We raised a couple $100,000 at that first statewide walkathon. So that was a unique job. It was really professional fundraising is what it was. It amounted to. I was commissioned as to how much money I raised, and I enjoyed that. But that was a 2-year thing, and it was I traveled too much. I was away from home too much, and after 2 years, I signed up for 2 years, and so after 2 years, I was glad to go on to something else.
I had to work. I didn't have to. I chose to work as a volunteer for a while. Unless you have a lot of means, in other words, money, most people can't afford to volunteer. It's hard to do it. Unless you have some really good extra free time. My heart was there, but my wallet wasn't. It didn't come down to the time for me as much as it came down to the money, the gasoline with the expenses and all that. I didn't mean to take away from what you were saying, but I think everybody at some point in their life has to throw their hat into the volunteering circle to give back, and that sounds like what you were doing there.
That was part of it, but to be honest, my motives were a little more selfish, I think, than that, because I felt as though I was gaining a great deal of personal growth being involved in the JCs. I was more confident getting in front of a group, more confident in talking. I mean, during that 2-year tenure, I remember going to an all-state board meeting and standing in front of 1,200 people and putting on a presentation, and felt perfectly comfortable doing it. Whereas a year before, you couldn't have got me on stage in front of 1,200 people if you held a gun to my head. It was just so I was getting something from the experience.
What do you remember when you're going through that transition? Was there something that made you feel more comfortable? Did you have any coaching? How did that change for you?
I think the coaching was all self-taught. I was just, I was always interested in, self-improvement books, and, of course I was in sales.
So you were doing some reading as well.
I was doing some reading as well, and trying to expand my horizons, you might say.
Right. So Paul, we go from you being working in sales and doing some work with philanthropy and volunteering, but you started, obviously, to get to where we're at now, there must have been a genesis. How did you get started? Did you buy a business?
No, I actually started a business. Now this is leaping forward, through the kids' development and school and all that. And when it got to be just Peggy and I, and the kids were pretty much all on their own, I decided that I wanted to do something completely different. I wanted to start a business. And so I had a friend of mine who was in the antique business, and he and I formed a partnership. And that worked okay for a while, but his method of doing business and my method seemed to be at loggerheads quite often. And so I just decided that I'd go on my own. And so I had a building, started a little antique shop, ran that for a while. And then my wife and I decided that we would open a convenience store in that location.
And where was that?
That was in Poland, Maine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in Poland Spring. And so we did. We opened a little convenience store. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with her, and we were trying to come up with a name for it. And I said, Poland corner variety. Oh, she didn't like that. And I said, well, how about just Poland variety? Well, that was too common. And I said, and we went through I'd thrown out about half a dozen examples, and she didn't like any of them. And in frustration, I said, well, it's just a ma and pa's. Oh, she says, I like that. I said, what do you mean? You like what? Ma and pa's. Ma and pa's what? She said, Ma and pa's convenience. We'll call it Ma and pa's convenience store. I says, do you like that? She says, yeah. He says, good. That's what we'll call it. I was just frustrated. Just move on to something else. So we called it Ma and Pa's. And it was very popular. People would come in and say, where's Pa? Or where's Ma? And, we became known as Ma and Pa's.
And how long did this go on for?
Oh, this went on. We had that little store. We ran it for, I don't know, years. And then I decided down the street there was another store that was for sale. And I talked to Peggy and I says, how about if I go down and I buy that store and you run this one and I'll run that one down the street? And she thought that was a good idea. And so I went down and I opened the store, and I called it Pa's General Store. And so I come home one day and she says to me, you're calling that Pa's General Store down the street? I says, well, yeah. I said, well, what would I call it? She says, Ma and Pa's 2 or something. I said, no. I says, that's a general store. It's a bigger store and all that. She said, oh, okay, no problem. So I come home one day about a week or two later, and the cranes are out there and they're changing the sign. And I said, well, what's going on? She says, I'm changing the name. I said, changing the name of what? She said, of the store. I said, what are you going to call it? She says, Ma's Variety. So I said, oh, good.
I love it.
So anyway, that became Ma's Variety, and I was running Pa's General Store.
I want to ask you, Paul, because I grew up in a small town like Poland, and there is something magical about the people that own the store. You're living inside of a fishbowl.
Oh.
Everybody knows you. You know everybody. Tell the audience a little bit about what it was like to be a centerpiece in a small town like Poland.
Oh, I would tell people all the time that this isn't a job. This is a way of life. We literally, this was how we lived our life. At this time, the first store, the kids were still in school. And so, we lived in the same building as the store was in. The kids, lived out back in an apartment, and they'd be in and out of the store. And, it was pretty challenging because we ran crazy hours. We'd open at 6 a.m, close at midnight.
Wow.
And we were open 7 days a week. And we each had a day off that we'd fly, but we were working crazy hours, with very little help. Well, as business improved, we added help. And then I bought the second store. And, so that grew into another business venture, which I decided to get into, and we started a video business.
Oh, like a VCR.
Yeah.
Beta.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you had movies.
I had movies. What happened was I had a friend who was a customer, and he worked for an outfit in Portland where they had just taken on VHS tape, and it was some electronics company in Portland. I don't even remember the name of it now, but they were selling VHS tapes to all the video stores and stuff. And so they would get the new releases and distribute them and all that. So this friend of mine came up with the idea. He says, all these video stores got thousands of movies, but he says, this was when he was talking to me. I was at Pa's General Store, and he says, "You as a general storekeeper, you could have 100 tapes in here, and just have a little video player, and you could rent movies to your customers. They come in every day, and they come back every morning, and they could return them." And so he says, and then there could be a mechanism where every 14 days or every 2 weeks, somebody would come in and exchange so many of those tapes out for different tapes. And he says, "I have this idea that I've been playing around in my head, but I'd really like to have a place to test it." And he says, "Would you be up for doing that?" I said, "Sure, I'd love to try something new." I was always looking for a new way to make an extra buck during the same time frame. So if I could add another profit center to the store, that was a wonderful thing, And it seemed like the rage was all VHS tape. I mean, you got to think back to when this was. This was top load VCRs.
Yeah, I'm thinking like late 70s.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, my wife and I were actually going to the video store because we couldn't go out. We couldn't get away. So we go to the video store and rent 4 or 5 tapes and then, have them for a couple, 3 days and then return them, pay all the late fees and all that. And, but it was cheap entertainment, I mean, it was like a night out. So anyway, I put in a video rack and we set up and we started renting movies. And it was a big hit. I mean, a big hit.
Oh, yeah.
And we would be sometimes down to half a dozen movies to pick from, and people would just take one because it was a movie and they could watch it at home.
Yeah.
And they had a VCR. And,
we would, Paul, not to interrupt, but we would go drive across several towns to get to the video store at that time, during that era.
Oh.
And if it was a special occasion like my brother's birthday or something, we would rent the VCR player because we were so poor we didn't have a VCR.
Yeah.
So we could rent the VCR player, and that included 2 or 3 movies for $15 or whatever it was, which was a lot of money then,
Yep.
But it was a special occasion. And that's what you were doing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we had 2 VCR players and we had 100 movies. And we were renting them. I mean, it became a real profit center.
Yeah.
It told myself and my colleague who had come up with the idea, and we were refining the idea all the time. So it had gotten from that to a company that would have thousands of movies and a fleet of vans and distributing to convenience stores throughout the state of Maine.
You?
Myself.
Oh, wow.
And this gentleman who became my partner.
Got it.
And I sold the general store, and we did a venture capital effort through a friend of mine, raised some money, and started this company. And it was called WVTR is what we called it, Wholesale Video Tape Rental. And so we were out, and I was in my elements because I was in sales, again. So I had developed 4 or 5 different programs where you could rent 100 movies and it was $3. I think it was $3 per movie per 14-day period. And so it was relatively expensive for somebody, but we encountered tremendous success. Now, remember, back then we were buying movies. They were $70, $80 a piece. And within months, we were placing orders for $250,000 for movies. And we had 200, 300, 400 stores that we were servicing within months.
Right.
I had bought a fleet of Astro vans from the Chevrolet dealership, a fleet meaning 6, and we hired 6 people, and we had a little distribution center. I hired a programmer to develop a software package for us, and we developed barcodes, and so we would scan the codes in the store, And we had a fellow we called him our program director.
Yeah.
And he worked in the warehouse.
Yeah.
And he would set up all the movies that are going to go in each store. And they were all tracked by computers so that we wouldn't repeat titles.
Right.
And they'd always get different movies. And this went nuts.
So this really sets the stage. This is funny. We're sitting here having a podcast conversation about
Fly fishing.
and we haven't even talked about it yet,
No.
but we've talked about a really interesting thing is that you obviously were building capital and business acuity to do what I'm seeing now. And now I'm starting to see the backdrop of you had some assets, some financial assets to start doing something like this at that point. But before we talk about that, Paul, tell me, how did the business change from...
Well, after the video business went this way, and it turned out not to be such an overwhelming success. It worked out. I mean, it was very good for 2 years, and then everybody got into the same thing. All of a sudden, in the beginning, I mean, I can remember the movie Gone with the Wind.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was released in the 40s. It was one of the biggest video rentals ever because millions of people had never seen Gone with the Wind.
Right.
So everything that was available in the video store and in our little setups in convenience stores was a new release to everybody. Okay. But it didn't take long, months, maybe after the first year. They had gone through that whole inventory of movies. Now they wanted to know what the new release was for the week or the month.
What was the demise of the industry, in your opinion?
Well, technology. I mean, all of a sudden you're getting movies on CDs and you can buy them cheap and, you don't have to rent them and you can buy them for what it costs of renting them. Then people, so it really went full circle in a very, very short period of time.
You rode the wave, though.
We did ride the wave, and we got out. And that's a whole other story. I mean, that was a financial failure for us personally.
So, did you get out of the video business?
The business ultimately failed. Because I mean, there was a time where we actually went to New York City in a limousine, and the business was doing such great numbers that they thought it might be worth bringing the business public.
Wow.
And within months of that, the business failed. Everything had to be new releases, and then we signed a big chain of stores that they were going through employment problems. It was hard to employ young people. I mean, the fast food places were busing kids from one town to another because there was a shortage of employees. And all of a sudden, that big chain that we signed up, we borrowed $1 million to do it, and they weren't returning the movies. The kids were taking the movies home. And, of course, once they get them out of the store, they can't bring them back because they were alone in the store when they took them out, and they closed for the evening. But in the morning when they come back, they didn't want to carry a tape because they didn't rent it, so they'd keep them. And so our shrink got intolerable, and this chain was responsible for it. So, long story short, the chain bailed out.
Was it Blockbuster?
No, it wasn't. No. It was the chain was a convenience store chain.
Oh, I understand.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they basically canceled and forced us to sue them, and this was litigation, and nobody wins in that situation.
But there was this little guy from Maine that was involved in this whole industry.
Yes, yeah, and so after that, I had a very good friend of mine who had started a pawn shop, and I was intrigued by that whole pawn shop idea, and I decided that I needed to see if I could find out as much as I could about the pawn shop business, and it didn't take long that I decided to open a pawn shop, and it was kind of funny because I had a conversation with him one time, and I said, "But how do you know what to lend? Because I mean, all of this stuff is, and computerization wasn't what it is today. Today it'd be real easy because everything's on computer, but it wasn't then." And I said, "How do you know what to lend?" And he had a little pinky ring on, and he takes the pinky ring off, and he says, "Paul," he says, you don't have to know that this is a 3-carat diamond and is worth $10,000. All you got to know is that you'll lend $100 on it. And I said, what? He says, that's what people, they're not looking to borrow they want to get the ring back. They just need $100 today. So he says, dumb it down a little bit. And he says, you'll be fine.
That's
interesting. And so anyway, I went into the pawn shop business.
Yeah.
And that I found great success in. That led me to this.
Let me ask you about that, because I've always been intrigued. I've never really talked to somebody that ran a pawn shop, about the business. I always think of the pawn part of it. In other words, someone comes in with that ring and they want $100 as being maybe 10% or 15 or 20% of your business. And the other majority of that being the piece of junk Japanese guitar that's on the wall for $125 that you're actually selling. That someone came in to sell rather than to pawn.
Yes.
Where are my numbers wrong on that, Paul?
Well, I mean, I always felt that the backbone of the business was the pawn side of the business. But as a pawnbroker, we used to advertise that we'd buy estates, complete estates, because we had a large retail side of the business as well. And my son was interested in snowmobiles and four-wheelers and all of that kind of stuff. And so we were doing a big business in that. I like boats and outboards and things like that. So we had a big yard, and we were moving a lot of those larger items, which brought a lot more money into the business. It was another profit center, but the pawn business, the pawn business is an incredible business. You lend somebody in Maine, unless they've changed the rules, it's 25% a month. So if you do the math on that, you put out $1, and over 12 months, you collect $3 back. You got to be pretty much brain dead not to make that work, or do no volume at all. Okay, of course, the issue is you want to build up your pawns as high as you can. But I can remember one lady, she had this little 25 Raven, little semi-automatic 25 Raven.
Which is a pistol.
It's a Saturday night special. It's one of those little cheapy Saturday night specials. They cost like $89 brand new. And so anyway, she used to bring it in and pawn it. And then one day she brings it in, pawns it. I would lend her $25. It would cost her $7.25 to renew the pawn at the end of 30 days. So she went to renewing the pawn every 30 days. And so one day I'm looking at the slips, and it would always track how many renewals had been done. And I'm looking at her little Raven, and she's on like 23. She's paid me $6.25 23 times to renew that $25 pawn. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
No.
So I felt bad, and it was November, and we're just getting into December. So I said to my son, I says, you know what? I says, everybody who's done 12 renewals or more, I said, when they come in, if it's a gun, because now if it's a gun, we got to go through the 4473 and call it in. And so I said, if it's a gun, tell them it's going to take a second. You go ahead and call it in, do the paperwork, but don't, collect the interest and then do the paperwork and then just give them back their guns. Tell them, hey, it's Merry Christmas. They just paid the interest. They didn't come in and pay the whole thing to get it back like they should, but we're making them a gift of it. We're going to give
That's good of you to do that.
Give them the gun back. So this particular lady, she comes in and we do the whole thing. My son gets the paperwork done before she's ready to leave, and I hand her back the gun. And she says, "Well, what's going on?" I says, "Well, it's Christmas. Merry Christmas. I'll just give you back your gun." "Well, what does that mean? I can't pawn it anymore?" I said, "You can pawn it anytime you want." I says, "But it's November." She said, "I can pawn it anytime I want?" I says, "Absolutely." She pushes it back to me. She says, "Let me borrow $25." Yeah. I turned around after she left. I said to my son, "Cut that! Cut no more of that! Don't stop that! Don't do that anymore. We're not making the impression we want to make."
This is great because you always wonder like what lives behind the curtain of the magician of like something like a pawn shop, because every town has one, or every significant town has one, and so there must be a story, Paul, about something shady.
Oh. There's always people who will try to beat the system or pawn something that's hot, it doesn't belong to them, and we've had all of that happen. My forte was that we worked real close with law enforcement. Our local police department worked with them, and they worked with us. And for the most part, that worked out very well. There were some departments that just felt that, oh, you guys are in the pawn business, you're thieves. And they wouldn't cut you any slack at all. But for the most part, I'm going to say 99% of the time, we had a great relationship with law enforcement, and we didn't like thieves any more than they did because it cost us money.
Can you think of a story?
Oh, I can think of, yes. We had a lady come in one time, and she pawned a black gun, a semi-automatic black gun, the assault weapon, they call them. And so she pawned it, and turns out she was in the midst of a divorce. And she grabbed one of her husband's guns and brought it in and pawned it. And so and she was down from Bitterford away, so she was a ways away. She went out of town to go do this. But she gave us her license and the whole thing, and everything was done legitimately. So of course, she never came back and got it. So we took the gun and after 2 months, we put it out on the rack for sale. We're supposed to only have to hold it for one. We're trying to give her the benefit of the doubt to pick up her gun. So anyway, after 60 days, I put it out in the rack, and this gentleman comes in the door one day, flashes a badge to me, says, "You have a 5.56 Bushmaster that belonged to a lady, pawned it." I says, "Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right." He says, "I need to take that gun with me." I says, "Say what?" He says, "I need to take that gun with me. It wasn't her gun to pawn." I says, "Well, okay, then you need to arrest her, and I'll hold the gun, and, we'll go." He says, "Look, we're going to do it one of two ways." He says, "We're going to take the gun with us, or we're going to take you in handcuffs with us for being possession of hot merchandise." And, and I knew right away when he said that, he was absolutely 100% wrong. He was wrong, and if I wanted to stand my ground, I could win that case.
Yeah, well, possession is 9/10 of the law, Paul, right?
But I was going to have to walk out of my shop with handcuffs in order to win that argument. And so I opted to give him the gun, okay? But, yeah, stuff like that happened.
Right.
And I could go on there's a lot of stories like that. The pawn business was a wonderful business most of the time,
How'd you get in? I know that you had an interest in collecting the sporting stuff, and that's what I'd like to start talking about now.
Yep.
What was the genesis? Did one piece come in that just really caught your eye, or were you going through a period in your life? What was it that started that for you?
Well, what started me collecting this stuff was snowshoes. Snowshoes.
Because of where we are.
Well,
tell people where we are and why it's significant in the snowshoe.
Well, we're in Oxford, and the next town over is Norway, Maine. And Norway was considered for many, many decades to be the snowshoe-making capital of the world. They made snowshoes. Probably that happened mostly because of the Second World War and the snowshoe production that was generated here locally. They were making snowshoes in Norway 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the military during the Second World War. They were shipping train car loads of snowshoes out of Norway.
Think of the 10th Mountain Division for the audience.
Exactly.
Okay.
They were making them for the 10th Mountain Division, and they were snowshoes that we would typically think of as pickerels.
Yeah,
they were commonly called pickerels or Alaskans, but they were the long, thin snowshoes. They were 4 feet long and 10 inches wide, and they were made for the 10th Mountain Division. So they made tens of thousands of pairs of those and shipped them out of Norway. But what intrigued me was not the snowshoes necessarily, but the snowshoe makers, the people who made snowshoes.
Tell me about that.
That got to be so interesting to me because the snowshoe making in Maine, up until 1907, it was a cottage industry. No one made snowshoes for a living. They made snowshoes when they couldn't do what they did for a living. It was out of season or something. So then they made snowshoes to supplement their income. But so you had farmers making snowshoes. You had rivermen who used to run the logs down the river making snowshoes. You had people who worked in orchards making snowshoes, lumberjacks making snowshoes, market hunters. And I didn't even know what a market hunter was. But, back in 1890, if you wanted a beef or you wanted meat, you'd hire the fellow down the street who would go shoot you a moose and bring it to you. And he was referred to as a market hunter.
Ah.
There wasn't no Hannafords or Shaws. There was market hunters. They'd get you quail and partridge, and they'd go fishing for you and bring you salmon and trout. And they were market hunters or fishermen. And that intrigued me. Think about all these different professions,
That's all right here in the backdrop of Maine.
All right here in the backdrop of Maine. Yeah.
So what happened to the snowshoe industry in Paris? It was obviously booming. I know that they expanded it. You have an incredible selection of sleighs here. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this collection because it's usually large, heavily weighted to this area's craftsmanship, which is, say, snowshoes, skis, sleighs and sleds, runner sleds, right? Tell me a little bit about that industry in general, how it grew, how it boomed, and what happened to it, based on your understanding as a businessman and historian.
Well, snowshoes, I think the boom of snowshoe making happened during the Second World War because they were making, leave it to the government, decades after the Second World War, they discovered warehouses full of snowshoes. Literally warehouses full that the government was paying rent on. And I have a personal friend of mine who bought a warehouse out in the Midwest, and there was 10,000 pair of snowshoes in it. And he bought them for pennies on the dollar, But anyway, after the Second World War, the demand for those snowshoes went way, way, way down. But ultimately, different materials. Snowshoes were made out of ash and rawhide. And originally, way back when Native Americans made snowshoes, they were made out of green allers, and they would do the toe and the heel of the snowshoe out of caribou hide, and the body, which is the center section where your foot was, out of moose hide. But what happened with the industry is that the demand for snowshoe making just fell away to almost nothing.
Do you think it was oversaturated?
Well, it went back to when it did. They had built up their employment and Norway, South Paris weren't the only ones making snowshoes. There were snowshoes being made out of the Midwest and all over the country. But the demand for snowshoes fell off by 50% because the military stopped buying. And then the materials changed. They started making snowshoes out of aluminum frames and other than rawhide material for the webbing. And the people who were making ash and rawhide snowshoes couldn't compete with China and the other importers of cheaply made snowshoes.
Now, and we were talking earlier, Paul, I told you that I was working in Farmington, and we used to sell snowshoes out of our little store there in the wintertime. And I remember distinctly an old timer from up around Phillips, Rangeley area came down. He wanted a new pair of snowshoes, and he knew we sold snowshoes. And of course, the wall was full of aluminum, right? And he says, "I'm not putting any of that lawn furniture on my feet." He wanted the traditional ones, right? So it did take a huge change. Now, why did it? Because obviously it was cheaper to make, it was faster, the material costs were lower, the production costs to make a pair of wooden snowshoes was definitely an endeavor. Let's segue though, because there was something else going on in the area that's related, and that has to do with Nash. Tell me about Nash and who he was.
Well,
because you have quite a collection of Nash.
John Waldo Nash was a taxidermist. He was the official taxidermist of the Grand Trunk Railroad. He had a car that they built for him. And when they'd go around and pick up all the sports all over to Pennsylvania and back up through, they'd pick up all the sports and bring them up to Maine to either go hunting or fishing or whatever. Nash had a car, and they would invite the sports in, and if it was fishing, that they would feature all the fish plaques. And he would invite the sports in, and he had little boxes that he would give out that had his label on it, and it was a little four-finger box that had a slide top, and there was instructions on how to deflesh the hide they referred to, the skin.
Yeah.
Deflesh the hide, and there was salts in the box, and you'd roll up the skin in the salts, put it in the box, close the cover, and he provided a little nail that you could nail the cover, and his label was right on it. You could mail it to him, and just put it in the mailbox, and the post office would bring it back to Norway, and they'd make you a fish plaque, out of that hide, out of that skin. It was really a kind of a clever marketing approach that he took, but they were very successful in
He had a patent.
He patented the process, yes. The plaques were all made at Paris Manufacturing Company locally, and he went in and he said to the folks at Paris, he says, I want to be able to come in and tell you how long it is, how tall it is, and how deep it is back to front, how much of a convex surface we want. And he says, so you're going to have to be able to figure out how you can do this. And they basically came up with a device that was the equivalent of a modern machine that might be computer driven, but this was all mechanical.
Yeah.
And I have some paperwork that I had gotten from the Nash estate, where it shows that the invoices from Paris Manufacturing for plaques, they were 50 cents a piece that they would charge for those plaques, And so anyway, that intrigued me. I loved the Nash plaques and the story behind them, but he passed relatively early, and his wife continued to do the taxidermy work for years and years after his passing.
Right.
Now I have books of letters from business tycoons all over the country, testimonial letters, and we received the plaque and we're so happy with it, and this and that, and I can remember reading one. They did a double plaque because they sent this to both skins, both sides, and so they did two fish.
I was going to ask you. I've heard, and I want you to confirm this, that you'd sometimes see that there was a fake adipose fin on a Nash because one half of the fish required the adipose fin, and yet he found a way that he could utilize the backside of the fish to make yet a second, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe the guide would get it.
Yeah.
You speak to that.
Well, I don't know how they preserved it, but yes, they would get another fin and make two fish plaques out of one fish,
Yeah.
But I imagine those fins were readily available to him.
Yeah.
And he had probably had a lot of sources, where he could get another fin.
So, let's see right on topic with Nash, because to me, it's so incredible. You see, I want the audience to go to our website and look at what a Nash mount is, but basically imagine something about the shape of a football in terms of its convex coming out of the wall with the really one-dimensional side or skin of the fish that's now been glued or laminated to it. And he almost always signed it. It says Nash somewhere on it.
Nash of Maine.
And, we think of them, if you walk into LL Bean's flagship store, you'd see at least, 3 to a half dozen of these Nash, mostly brook trout. But as we sit in Paul Cote's collection, Utah.
Well, it's funny you bring up LL Bean because I bought all those fish. They were at the fishing department at LL Bean. They were all fish that were caught by George Morrill, who was an avid fly fisherman, and Footer was a good friend of his, and so George would catch fish, bring them to Footer to redo, and then he'd bring them over to LL Bean to put on the wall, because George had no more wall space at his home or camp to hang another fish.
Yeah.
Although he loved these fish plaques, and so they sat down at LL Bean for years.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, it turned into a little bit of a problem when he sold me the fish. He called me and told me to go down to LL Bean, take a look, and make him an offer, and I did. And while I was there with my clipboard and I'm making notes, the gentleman come walking over to me, a fellow from behind the counter, and he says, "Can I help you, sir?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm just taking inventory of the fish flies that are up here." And he said, "Well, why are you doing that?" I said, "I'm going to buy them." He says, "They're not for sale." I said, "Well, no, they are for sale." I said, "The fellow who owns them," he says, "LL Bean owns them." I said, "No, I don't think so." I says, and then all of a sudden I realized he has no idea. He thinks that they own the fish. He doesn't know that they're here on loan. So I stopped the conversation. I said, "That's okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate your help." And I left. I called George up and I says, "Hey, you have proof that those are your fish?" He says, "Paul, I'm an attorney." He says, "I'm an auctioneer, but I'm an attorney." Initially, yeah. I said, "I got a contract and everything." He says, "I'll dig it out." And he says, "I'll give it to you so you'll have it with you the next time you go up." I said, "I'm not going up again until you call somebody up there and let them know that those are not their fish, they're for sale." So anyway, I went back up the next time, and everybody was really nice and polite, and they had totes for me to put the fish in and all that.
You didn't bring the sheriff with you?
No, I didn't bring the sheriff with me. I brought the contract with me. And we had no trouble at all,
So those Nash fish from Beans are now on your wall here?
Not a one.
Not a one?
They all went like that.
Yeah, you sold them.
Yeah, I sold them. Yeah. I sold them real quick,
But I was going to say, thank you for adding that, Paul. But, we think of just brook trout, but in your collection here in Oxford, you've got about every main species of fish that Nash could have ever thought about putting on a plaque.
Well, he liked, salmon and trout. That was his forte. But every once in a while, somebody would come in. I have a pickerel on a plaque there chasing a minnow. And so the minnow is in the pickerel's mouth, or partly in the pickerel's mouth. Nash mounted that. And there's kind of a funny story because that fish plaque wound up at Footers to be restored. And it was Polly, that's Dave's wife, wanted to charge for two fish. The little minnow was only about that long. She wanted to charge the person who brought it in for two fish. And he said no, and he took it back. And I guess ultimately it was restored.
Yeah.
And they only got charged for one fish.
You've talked about Footer, and who Paul's referring to is Dave Footer, who was in the Auburn area. Dave was really a protege of Herb Welch.
Yes.
Herb Welch was really one of the first real fish artists in the state of Maine.
Yeah.
And we have, we did a whole podcast with Leslie Hilliard on Herb Welch, so we won't go down the Herb Welch rabbit hole too far. Let's talk a little bit about the collection you have of Footer pieces and Herb Welch pieces, because you showed them to me earlier. Just give me a sense of what piece of Maine history you're holding here.
Well, I attempted to have fish plaques from all of the Maine artisans. So that you mentioned Herb Welch and Dave Footer, but of course you got Gene Barr, who's contemporary and still working. But you had Reggie Edwards doing fish like that. Lawrence Irving, of course, was well known as carving fish. More folk art examples of fish, but nonetheless, there was quite a number of people producing fish plaques over the years. But the biggies, Billy Hatch was another one, certainly, out of Keezer Falls, Maine. So there was a number of people, but the real artisans, the original artisans, had to be Herb Welch, Dave Footer. Of course, Nash was a real artisan, because when they used to work on these hides, I saw a little black and white snippet of film from the Aquatic Museum. One day I was watching, and they were showing how Herb was taking a fish hide out of a crock that had been soaking in some kind of brine mixture that he had made. And when he pulled it out, it looked like he was pulling out a sheet, a white sheet. There was absolutely no pigment in that hide whatsoever. So when you see one of these fish, skin mounts, all of the color has been added to after the fish was mounted on a plaque. So it was all painted on. So that's where the artistry comes in for these taxidermists. They create it, because when they process that hide, it just comes out as a hide, and it's white.
Yeah.
No pigment in it at all.
No, let's not lose focus. So we're talking really about two different forms of art. We're talking about taxidermy, which is putting skin on a wooden, in this case, in Herb Welch's case, on a wooden base.
Form.
And then you've got fish carving. I think Irving was a carver.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yes, he was.
So those are two distinct art forms, but
Yes.
you have amassed a huge collection of them.
And some of these artists did both. Dave Footer carved fish and did fish skin.
Yeah, Gene Barr as well.
Gene Barr as well.
And Herb Welch?
Herb Welch, I think he carved fish as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's take a quick break and let's come back. And I want to pick up and talk about what the next step was.
Yeah.
In this Flyline flashback, we step into a workshop in Norway, Maine, where fish weren't just preserved, they were transformed into something closer to art. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, if you caught a fish in Maine worth remembering, there was one name many anglers trusted: John Waldo Nash. Born in Sweden in 1862 and later settling in western Maine, John Nash built a reputation across the United States and Canada as a leading taxidermist. But what set him apart wasn't just preservation, it was innovation. His signature technique, known as the trout mezzo, redefined what a fish mount could be. Instead of mounting a full fish, Nash used the real skin and structure of one side, placing it on a convex wooden panel. With glass eyes and hand-painted detail, the fish appeared dimensional, not flat, not fully sculpted, but somewhere in between. The result was something part taxidermy, part painting, part sculpture. Nash was able to secure a patent for this invention, making any sample of this style unique and easily distinguishable. These pieces didn't just display a catch, they captured a moment and a memory. Depending on the scale of work the customers requested, behind many of the unique mezzo mounts were painted backgrounds, water, shoreline, and habitat, turning each mount into a complete visual setting. It was Nash's wife Alice that painted these one-off backgrounds. Together, their work moved beyond trophy and into storytelling. Nash's work was also closely tied to Maine's growing sporting economy. He served as an official taxidermist for the Grand Trunk Railway, and his mounts helped promote Maine as a destination for anglers. At a time when railroads were bringing visitors north, his fish helped define what success in those waters looked like. His reputation extended far beyond Maine. Nash exhibited at major international expositions, including the 1900 Paris Exposition and the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, earning recognition and awards for his work. From his two-story workshop in Norway, supported by assistants and agents across the state, Nash met a growing demand. This was an era before replicas, before photographs were common on the water, and long before catch and release became the norm. A mounted fish was proof not just of size, but of place and experience. John Waldo Nash didn't just preserve fish, he helped shape how Maine fishing culture was remembered, in wood, paint, and the form of a fish that looked, even in stillness, like it might move again. And now, back to the second half of this episode.
Well, I want to think about where we left off. We were talking about Herb Welch, and we were talking about Dave Footer. That really begs the question, what's the transition from you having a pawn shop to starting to see this stuff walk through the door? What happened there?
Well, I mentioned that I liked snowshoes and the stories behind them.
Yes.
And so I started collecting them. And when I got up to about 2,000 pair, I thought, hey, maybe I ought to diversify a little bit. And that's when I started thinking about the fish plaques and the carvings and all of the different aspects of collecting Maine-made artifacts and Maine-made artists. But my idea of an artist was not somebody splattering a lot of paint on a canvas. My idea was somebody who carved a fish and made it look like a fish, or carved a bird and made it look like a bird. That to me was artistry, and I really, really appreciated the art form, and so I got into collecting some of the artists I had a connection with. Reggie Edwards was my shop teacher when I was a boy in grammar school, and I knew Reggie personally. And I can remember as a kid, he'd bring in these carvings, and our eyes would roll back in our head, and we couldn't care less about any of it, And he was all excited about it, but it didn't mean anything to us, We were kids, But later in years, when I went back and started acquiring his carvings, I realized that, boy, I should have been buying those when Reggie was bringing them into the school, and we could buy them for $20. Although $20 back then might as well have been $2,000 for us. Right. We were arguing with our parents to get 25 cents to go to the Sadie Hawkins dance. So $20 would have been out of the question. But anyway, there was a personal connection with Reggie, and so I started collecting his fish and his birds, and then that led to Lawrence Irving, and it led to Herbie Welch, and it led to Dave Footer, and then I got to meet Dave, and I bought a couple of really, really rough Nash mounts. Well, actually, they came in through the pawn shop, and I brought them over to Dave, and I says, "Is there anything you can do with these at all?" "Oh, sure." He says, "We can put those right back, bring those right back to life." Well, he says, "They'll look brand new." Well, that's one thing about Dave. He did make them look brand new. And,
good, bad, or indifferent.
Yeah, well, they became a Nash. They went from being a Nash mount to being a Dave Footer mount. And I say that tongue in cheek. I always liked, as an example, bringing, after a few experiences of having Dave put his own touch on the restorations, I learned that I could bring them to Gene Barr, and Gene would respect the authenticity of the mount and restore it, and not so much put his signature on that mount. So that was that began to mean something to me, to keep it a Nash mount and not have it become a Dave Footer mount.
And also, you have something that lived in the camp, and the mice chewed on it, and the fin got broken when it got moved, and it has tremendous value. But it doesn't have any value if your wife won't let it keep it on the wall because it looks so ugly. So that's where a guy like Gene Barr comes in.
Yeah.
And he can take something that has maybe some really important historical provenance and make it so it's acceptable to look at again. Yeah. And I love what you said, how he didn't make it look like a Gene Barr fish. He made it look like a Herb Welch fish, that maybe the way that it looked the day that Herb finished it back in 1936.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. A Herb Welch fish. Or the Nash fish.
Right.
That was a biggie. The Nash ones were really hard to keep authentic,
right.
And Gene could do it, do a nice job.
And still does.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So anyway, I met a lot of these people. Some of them were working. Some of them have since passed. Unfortunately, several of them have passed. The people that I liked, and I liked their work. There was a guy named Norm Vesey from Wells, Maine, who carved birds, and he was fabulous. I mean, the color and the poses and stuff. He was great, yeah. And I got him to start carving pairs for me, male and female, on the same perch, and he did work for me for probably the better part of a decade.
Right.
And then he succumbed to his illnesses and unfortunately passed.
Let's talk about firearms. Because you have an incredible collection. Now, just to preface the conversation, Paul, you told me in our earlier conversation that you kind of get away from having to deal with stuff that required federal oversight.
Well, I mean, if you deal in modern firearms, you have to have a federal firearms license, and that's a whole different ball game, and it requires that you record keeping, and I understand the reason for all of that. It's just that I get tired of having the hassle of it and audits and all of everything that went with having a federal firearms license. And so I had a friend of mine who he had a federal firearms license and then stopped, turned in his license and dealt exclusively with antique firearms. And I decided that that was the way I wanted to go. And then as I got into it a little more, again, the same interests began to develop, and the fact that some of these guns were they were all made by hand.
And you have a large collection of Maine-made guns.
Well, I have some Maine-made guns.
Okay, I should say.
I wish I had. I have a friend who, again, unfortunately, is no longer with us. His name was Dwight Demerit, and Dwight wrote several books on Maine-made guns, and he had an enormous, wonderful collection of Maine-made guns, which is now, unfortunately, in the bowels of the Maine State Museum, I think. I think they've displayed a few, but he had hundreds.
So people made guns in Maine.
Oh, they sure did.
Just like they made fly rods in Maine, they made guns in Maine.
Exactly. Every community, if you stop and you think about 100 years ago, well, even 150 years ago, let's go that far back, you had to have one of everything in every community almost. I mean, you had to have a blacksmith, and you had to have a livery stable, and you had to have a gun maker, and you had to have a market hunter, because there was no Shaws or supermarkets or malls or internet sales or anything like that. Everything that community needed, pretty much, if it was any size at all, had to be self-contained.
Right.
So you had to have a pharmacist and a doctor, and all of these things had to be in each little community.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a lot of gun makers in Maine. Mm-hmm. As it turns out, every major community had a gun at least one. Some of them had two. Mm-hmm. So I had an interest in the Maine-made guns, Maine-made firearms. My particular interest was with the Evans Rifle Company, because they predated. Anybody who's familiar with Winchester firearms knows what a Golden Boy is, or a Model 66. That was the predominant earliest lever-action rifle, centerfire rifle, that was produced in any quantities. Mass-produced is what I was looking for. Of all the firearms in the country. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out it wasn't. There was a little company in Mechanic Falls, Maine called the Evans Rifle Company, and its patent dates went to 1861. The Winchester gun was 1866, also the Model 66, also called the Yellow Boy, because it had a brass receiver. So 4 years before Winchester was this little company in Mechanic Falls that had made the Evans rifle. And it was an Evans 44, and that's actually the caliber, Evans 44. It's a proprietary cartridge, doesn't fit anything else, which was part of its demise. It's kind of like the Sony. Remember when we were VHS tapes? You had VHS tapes, and then you had the Sony.
Yeah, that's right.
The one that was left all by itself.
Yeah.
Well, that's what the Evans 44 was always in my mind. You know, they made a mistake.
That's an excellent analogy.
But anyway, at one time, I started collecting Evans rifles, and at one time I had 42 of them, and they only ever made 20,000 in their total existence, and their existence went over a period of about a decade. Yeah. But they did everything trying to make it work. You know, the Evans Rifle Company was 2 years after they succumbed to bankruptcy, and they'd swept the factory floor up, and there was no more trace of an Evans rifle anywhere. There was a ship that came into port at Searsport, Maine, with an envoy, a person who came off the ship looking for the Evans Rifle Company, with an order in his hand of 25,000 Evans rifles from Russia. And Russia wanted to order 25,000 Evans rifles 2 years after Evans went out of business. And 25,000 Evans rifles, again, I'll repeat, Evans only made 20,000 rifles in 10 years. So that would have been quite an order.
Yeah, that would have been
that might have saved them, you know. But anyway, it's a very odd gun. It held the first iterations of the Evans rifle, only had an 1.25 inch 44 caliber bullet, and you could put 32 of them in the gun. Now remember, This is an 1861 when a year or two before that, the only way to shoot a gun was to a ramrod and a muzzle loader, and you run a ball down the rifle and put a wad behind it and powder and all that and shoot them one at a time. And Evans comes up with this gun in 1861 that you can put 32 rounds in and just keep cocking the lever and shooting one after the other.
You and I could be in their factory, the location of their factory, in 15 minutes from where we're sitting right here.
Exactly.
Now, that's an incredible story. And, you're preserving history, Paul. I mean, I'd never heard of the Evans
rifle company
until today. But you did say something earlier that I also was really interested in that you have an F.E. Thomas rod collection.
Yep.
Talk to me a little bit about the ownership of that and how it's moved through museums and how it's come back to you.
Well, a very good friend of mine, his name is Jerry Gerard, and Jerry called me one day and he said he had a friend whose name was Bob Stewart, and Bob had a collection of F.E. Thomas fly rods that were at the Aquasic Museum. And Bob is from Bend, Oregon, I think, and he would come to Maine almost every year and go fishing at the Upper Dam and love fly fishing here in Maine. And he loved the F.E. Thomas fly rods and loved the idea that they were made here in Maine, in Bangor. And so at one point, he really developed an interest in them and talked to the people at the museum. And he had acquired quite a few F.E. Thomas rods. And somebody introduced him to an ancestor of F.E. Thomas. It was a lady. And she introduced Bob to another lady. And pretty soon he was talking to 3 or 4 people who were all in the family and all had fly rods. And they were all in their late years. They had long since given up fly fishing. So he started acquiring these rods from the family. And he acquired quite a collection. I have a rod in there that was made by the people in the factory. It was made for Frank Thomas's 60th birthday. And it's a presentation rod that they gave him on his 60th birthday.
To the owner of the company. That must be a pretty fancy.
That's a pretty slick rod,
And you have it.
I have it, yeah. It's one of a kind.
And now being a fly fisherman, being a guy, but also being interested in Maine history and folklore and art, it's really hard to walk into a place other than the Maine State Museum and actually take in visually what these things look like. And you're offering that now. But Paul, you didn't always offer that before. In getting introduced to you through our mutual friend, Bill Pierce, he explained to me that you had a private collection for a while, and now it's kind of transitioned into an enterprise for you. Talk to me a little bit about how that has gone about.
Well, all of this that you're looking at here, Mike, is my collection. It's a collection of all of the things that has passed through my hands over the last 40 years. I chose to hold on to personally, because it was just it hit something with me, an interest or something like that. The carvings mostly because they were Maine artisans and that type of thing, and the guns because they were Maine guns, some of them, but not all, mostly not all. I enjoyed collecting all of these artifacts, and as they would pass through my hands, I would decide whether this was going to go for sale or it was going to go in my collection. And so I've sold many, many, many examples of everything that you see here. But this, to me, is the best of the best. The skis are a great example of that. You look at the skis, and I have skis that have perfect labels of 100-year-old skis. It's out of the question, or snowshoes. Another good example. These were all basically water transfer labels that were on a lot of the snowshoes. Now, a few of them were burned in, but most of them were water transfer labels. You take a pair of snowshoes out and you walk with them winter after winter after winter, those labels disappear, or they get cuffed and broken, or they get defigured so you can't read them. Well, I can look at a pair of snowshoes that's got a piece of a label, and I can pretty much tell you who made them because I've looked at so many original labels.
Right.
I know what they look like. But I would keep the snowshoes that had the perfect label and sell the rest.
Right.
I would keep the wagons that had the perfect spokes and sell the ones that the wheels were wobbly on, or just the ones that weren't quite up to par to put in the collection.
And when you walk in the front door of this, I'm going to call it a gallery.
Okay.
The first thing I noticed, my eye caught the Herb Welch book trout from 1919.
1919. No, you're right.
And, that's like the crown jewel. It's a crown jewel of Maine taxidermy. And, I remember, we won't throw numbers around, but that went for a lot of money at the auction that you sat at and watched some rich guy buy it. And then later on, it came back to you for less than what he paid for it. And that's kind of the story of how all this stuff comes about.
Yeah. Well, it was. I'd gone to that auction to buy that fish plaque because I really thought I was going to be able to buy it, and turns out I didn't have it. I had about 25% of what it sold for.
Right.
Actually, closer to 20% of what it sold for.
And you said you dug through the sofa cushions just to find that money.
Yeah, I rummaged around the sofa cushions to come up with enough money that I thought really I was going to buy it. That's plaque. But anyway, it did come back to me in a kind of odd way. And I was very, very glad to acquire it and have it as part of the, as part of the inventory now, but part of the collection then, but I have 4 or 5 items in the collection. One is right next to you that we haven't talked about at all, but that's a Winchester gun cabinet sitting there. And it doesn't look like much. That's circular 1920, 25. It was a Winchester dealer item.
Right.
You couldn't buy one.
No.
As a consumer.
It looks like a display piece.
It was for display.
Yeah.
And you'll notice that the top is a pyramid shape and is glass. And if you think in terms of 1920, what kind of lighting was in a Winchester store, display store, there wasn't much lighting. In some cases, it might have been even gas lighting or something. So you needed to draw as much light into the cabinet as you could. That cabinet held 20 rifles. It doesn't seem possible, but there's 4 sides and of 5, and it was designed for lever action rifles, not bolt action rifles. Like I say, it was a dealer item. So the only way to get one was to be a Winchester dealer and to order a certain package from Winchester, and they give you the cabinet.
Right.
And I have heard estimates that there were as few as 250 of those things made.
Right.
The last one sold at Rock Island, I think it was Rock Island Armory, last year or the year before, and it brought $38,800.
Right.
And I tracked them back about 10 years, and they started out at $4,500 to $5,000, but climbed every single year to $38,800.
So the guy that has a Winchester collection, he wants to have the dealer cabinet to showcase his collection in.
Yeah.
So that does have that kind of value to the collector. Yep. And there's a lot of collectors out there. I mean, over the years, you and I were throwing around some names earlier. I've guided Jim Julia from Fairfield area, who's an auction guy. And, Gary Guyette, you have a big collection of duck decoys.
Mm-hmm.
Gary Guyette is one of the leading names. I mean, Maine is no stranger to people like yourself that have great interest in Maine sporting memorabilia. If you had to send a new message, if maybe 15 years ago you said, I have a private collection, what would your new message be to someone listening to this podcast? Who is Paul Cote and what are you trying to do today?
Well, what I've decided to do with the collection is to liquidate it. I've been to many, many auctions over the years, over the decades, and I've seen auctions, how they work and how they're, I have too many of the same things to be successful in an auction. As an example, I'd said at one time I had 2,000 pair of snowshoes. I've whittled that all the way down to about 1,000 pair. So if you turn this over to an auctioneer, and he's going to have it'd have to have a 3-day auction. I mean, there's thousands of items here, okay? But let's take the snowshoes as an example. I got some snowshoes that are worth $600-800 for a pair.
How much?
$600 to $800.
Oh, I think they'd be worth more than that.
For a pair.
Yeah.
I mean, Millie Dunham snowshoes, spring snowshoes, stuff like that. They're rare. It's rare stuff. So you sell, let's say you sell 10 pair of snowshoes at your 3-day auction, and they bring pretty good money. And you sell 10 more, and then 10 more, and then 10 more, and then 10 more, and you aren't up to 1,000 yet. By the time you get to there, they're not selling for $70, $80, $90, $100 a pair. They're selling for $50, $60, and then it's going to go to $30, $40, and then it's going to be 2 pair for $40. And, so
diminishing returns then.
Yeah. So I knew that an auction was not the answer. And nor that I want to see a 40-year collection evaporate in front of my eyes in 3 days. Okay. I didn't, the joy I've had over the last 40 years is acquiring this collection, not having it. Okay. So it was the search and the finding of this piece or that piece. And that had pretty much come to a standstill for me. At 80 years old, I had limited space. I didn't have wall space enough to hang another fish plaque. I didn't have shelf space enough to put another duck decoy up or another fish creel up. So in order to be able to continue, I'm not looking this is a morbid thing that I want to liquidate the collection. I want to keep buying. I want to keep going to auctions. I want to keep going to antique shops. I want to keep inviting pickers who come to me 3 times a week with some wonderful thing that they found in a house. I want to continue that part of the journey. And so in order to do that, I have to start liquidating some of these things that I've had for many, many, many years.
Who was your customer?
Who is my customer? Well, people who've got a man cave and want to decorate it. And so my customer is not only that person, but that person's wife or daughter or son who's trying to find something for their dad who's got everything, and they can't imagine what in the world they could get him that he doesn't already have. I have it.
So who walks in to Paul Cote's place and gives you $2,000 for a rare Nash piece? Is it that person you just described?
Yeah. I think so. It's that person who has a place on his wall and he's heard about Nash mounts and he doesn't have one yet, and he wants one.
Yeah.
So and the other thing, it's my collection is not strictly, I mean, I have Paris manufacturing wagons, little toys, toy wagons that were made in the 1800s, that are just like they were never played with. I mean, there's a lot of wagons, but you gave it to a little boy 100 years ago, he'd carry rocks in it, and try to carry wheelbarrows in it. And he'd beat it up and pull the handle off of it. I've had a lot of those kind of wagons and sold parts and pieces, and people have restored them. And I've sold a lot of pieces for restoration purposes. But the ones I got that finally I settled on were the ones that were loved more than played with, and they're just in wonderful condition.
Yeah, and you asked me to ask you about a particular sleigh.
Yeah, I have 2 pieces in the collection that are really outstanding. They came to me in completely different circumstances. They are a sled from Paris Manufacturing and a doll carriage from Paris Manufacturing. And they were made by Paris Manufacturing in 1876 for the Philadelphia World Exposition. They were made for the First World's Fair. And the carriage won first prize in its class. And the sleigh was also a prize winner, but I've never been able to determine whether it was first, second, or third.
Yeah.
And that was only 3 designations that were given then. I first heard about the sleigh from Hank Morton, who was a great grandson, I think, of the founder, Henry Morton.
Of Morton.
Of Paris Manufacturing.
Got it.
Morton's owned the company.
Okay, that's just a point of clarification.
So when Hank graduated from college, he became their sales manager. And within a very, very short period of time, he was their national sales manager. Paris Manufacturing had an office here in South Paris, but they also had an office on the 7th floor in New York City in the toy building. They were a national company. They had offices in Atlanta, Georgia, Houston, Texas, San Francisco. And Hank used to leave here and go to New York and then hit all the other spots as the national sales manager. And he would, talk to the people and fill orders and, what was the other people looking for and what could they do for them from the home office to help sales. And so he was with the company through thick and thin, from graduating from college to being with them when they first changed hands, when the company was sold out of the Morton family to someone else. And it had been sold several times to someone else. And Hank was still the national sales manager. Well, Hank had told me about this sled, and he showed me pictures of it, actually. And the sled says, Paris Hill Manufacturing Company, Oxford County, Maine, USA. And it's dated 1876 for the 1876 Philadelphia World Exposition. Now, this is done on a burgundy background, and all the lettering is done in gold leaf. And it's a fabulous looking sled. I mean, but it's all writing, okay? Typically, what you find on a sled is a bird or a flower or something painted on the sled. This is all writing, okay? And I say that because of something that I'm about to tell you about. So anyway, Hank told me about this sled, showed me a picture of it and everything. He says it used to hang over the door in New York City in our corporate offices in New York. And he says, I was down there one time, and he says, the gentleman who owned the company mentioned to me that I probably, he says, he had to tell him, as I remember the story, and I hope I'm not forgetting any part of it, but he was told by the gentleman who currently owned the company that before he left that day, he should get a ladder out of the utility closet and go up over the door, take the sled down, put it under your arm, Hank, put the ladder against the wall, don't explain yourself to anybody, and just walk out the door with the sled. And the reason was that he had just confided in Hank that he was pulling the plug on the company. He says, we can't manufacture sleds out of ash and, oak, steering sleds with steel runners and everything. The Chinese are making these things out of plastic, and they're little circles, and they're selling them for $3, and we're trying to get $30 for a steering sled, and we're bleeding money. And he says, we're hemorrhaging money, and we can't keep it up. He says, so we're going to close the company. He says, but I think that sled should go with the Morton family. And he says, I want you to take it with you.
And you have it.
I have it.
Yeah, and someone could come in and look at that now.
Yes.
Now, it's interesting. We're talking in a fly fishing podcast. You remember as a kid, Paul, using a runner sled?
Oh, yeah.
It's a lost art. It's one of the funnest things you can do on ice and snow.
Until you put your tongue on the steel bar.
Yeah.
But that's not fun.
I remember we had a hill behind my house, not directly by my house, but, down the road, it was basically like a packed snow road rather than a plowed snow road. And when the conditions were right, you felt like an Olympic bobsled or a luge guy. And I don't think people understand how fun that is.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a whole world of it back. I mean, for them to be as prolific and productive as they were in Paris, Maine, the runner sleds, there must have been a market.
There was a huge market for runner sleds, and Paris Manufacturing and Flexible Flyer were the Ford and Chevy of the sled business. Okay, Flexible Flyer was out in Pennsylvania, I think. Paris Manufacturing was in South Paris, Maine. Hank, when he retired from the sled business, pretty much forced out, did something very, very clever, very smart, because he was a very intelligent man. He knew everybody in the sled business all across the country, all the competition as well. And they were all suffering, and they couldn't maintain this level of manufacturing at the way they were doing it. But there was value in the company name, Paris Manufacturing, and there was value in the company name, Flexible Flyer. And he bought them both. He bought the names of both companies and licensing to be able to continue. And Hank, as we speak today, is in the sled business with his 2 adult sons, ordering sleds out of China, sometimes Canada. Canada's made a lot of sleds, and they'll make Flexible Flyer and Paris Manufacturing sleds on the same frame. They're just how they're painted up. And they sell them out to mass merchants all over the country, on a much, much smaller scale than they did in the old days. But there's still a market for those old sleds that steer.
We used to buy them at the hardware store or the local grain store.
Yep.
Or even, you remember Lavertier's?
Oh, sure.
Lavertier's had them.
Yeah.
And it was just a thing, and then you throw them in the barn, they last forever.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But the ones that you have were probably never used and always loved.
Well, I have a lot of sleds, but the sled that I was telling you about that says Paris Hill Manufacturing, it was always Paris Manufacturing after 1882. Prior to 1882, it was Paris Hill Manufacturing.
I understand the distinction. Paris Hill is kind of the high cotton of this area.
Yes.
Right. That's where the rich people live in the area.
Yeah. And that's where Paris Manufacturing started.
It is,
up on Paris Hill.
Interesting.
So anyway, after this sled disappeared in New York City, and Hank didn't take it home that day.
Oh, he didn't?
No. Well, he was filled up, he said, and he had all kinds of stuff, and he was going to make his trap line and come back to New York and grab the sled and come home. He came back to New York and went up, and the sled was gone. So at this point, he just went back to the elevator and came back to South Paris, and the sled was lost. He had told me, so I don't know whatever happened to it, So one day I get a call out of the blue from a gentleman speaking with a distinct Southern drawl, and he said, "Hello, is this Mr. Cote?" And I said, "Yes, this is Mr. Cote. How can I help you?" "Mr. Cote," he says, "I've been referred to you." He says, "I've actually found your name online." He says, "When I Googled Paris Manufacturing Company," I says, "I've done a few talks to the historical societies and stuff like that about Paris sleds and wagons." And I said, "That's probably where you picked it up." He says, "I believe so." But anyway, he says, "It was quite a feat from that, getting your name to getting your phone number." But he says, anyway, he says, "I'm glad to see that I got the right Mr. Cote." He says, "I have a sled down here, Mr." I said, "Where are you calling from?" He says, "I'm calling you from Paradise, Texas." I said, "Really?" I says, "So what can I do for you?" He says, "Well, I got a sled down here," and he says, he says, "if it had a bird or a flower on it," he says, "I could have sold it 12 times. But he said, just got a bunch of writing all over it." I says, "Really?" I said, "What's it say?" He says, "Let me see here." He says, "It says Paris Hill Manufacturing," and I just about fell on my butt. I mean, I'm grabbing a hold of the furniture, trying to hold up, and my knees are letting out from under me. He's got the sled. And I says, "Can you repeat that?" He says, "Yeah, Paris Hill Manufacturing Company, Oxford County, Maine, USA."
I'll give you $100 for it right now.
And it says 1876 on the top.
I'll give you $125 for it.
I would have given him $5,000 for it. I was so excited. I says, well, and this is a 20-minute story after this, but let me just say that from that conversation, it was 2 years before I got that sled in the mail, and just went through a comedy of errors, and this man going back into what he called the sanitarium, which was the nursing home.
Yeah.
But I lost track of him.
Yeah.
I would call his number. In the beginning, I was calling his number every day, and then it went to every other day, and then once a week, and then once a month, and then once every other month. And 2 years later, the phone rings. "Hello, is this Mr. Cote?" I recognized the voice right away. I said, "Where you been?" "Well, I've been in a sanitarium," and so anyway, 2 years it took me to get that sled.
And everything you have in here has a little story like that.
Everything.
And I know you and I could tell. I invite the audience to come and visit Paul Cote because I'm having a great time listening to these stories and every single artifact you have and every single piece you have. I mean, as we're sitting here in your office, Paul, I can see at least 16 to 20 pair of really high-end antique snowshoes. And for Mainers to really kind of dig into the roots of what we came from and know what manufacturing existed in Western Maine, you've got a gold mine of it here.
Yeah.
Both sporting related stuff with fishing and hunting, but also recreation.
Yeah.
And is there anything else you want to add, Paul, before we wind up the conversation?
Well, no, only that, this was such a joy putting together over 40 years. And I look forward to letting go of it as well, because I believe truly that we're just the custodians of these artifacts for a short period of time, while we're here. And we love them and we take care of them. And I want to put them back in the hands of people who are going to enjoy them and take care of them as well as I did, And, I feel very, very strongly that, museums are fine, they're wonderful, but museums have collected so much stuff that unfortunately today, when you donate large quantities of stuff to museums, they generally wind up in the bowels of the museum and down in the the dungeons, not on display anymore because they don't have a room to display them anymore. And I want this stuff to be in people's homes and people on exhibit and people talking about it and sharing it with their friends. And when they're done with it, they can do it as I did. They can pass it on to somebody else who will take good care of it.
It means everything for you to tell your story to our audience, and I really appreciate the privilege of your time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you too.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us for this intimate discussion, and thank you for listening to Flyline Podcast. We're proud to be sponsored by Geiger, the world's largest family-owned promotional products distributor based in Lewiston, Maine. Their support helps us share the rich history of Maine's fishing community through the stories that will be cherished for generations. A new Flyline Podcast episode is released every 2 weeks on Tuesdays, so be sure to come back to meet our next famous guest. Until then, this is Michael Jones, and we invite you to visit the blog section of our website to enjoy photos and contributions from our guests and experience all of the episodes at flylinepodcast.com.